Helen sat in her favorite armchair, staring at the grandfather clock in the corner of her living room. It ticked with the same rhythm it always had, but now each tick sounded louder, heavier, like a reminder, like a countdown. She had exactly 3 months left to live. That's what the doctor had said. No more than 90 days. Stage 4, too far gone. Make the most of your time, he'd added gently, as if there was still something left to make. She'd nodded, thanked him, and walked home alone. No treatments, no calls to family, no bucket list. Just silence. Helen was 68, retired, widowed, and childless. Her husband Walter had died 8 years earlier from a heart attack. She'd watched him collapse in the garden while pulling weeds. He died before the ambulance arrived. Since then, the house had grown quieter and her life smaller. She used to be a librarian. She used to host Sunday dinners for her neighbors. She used to laugh, but over the years, people drifted away. Friends moved. Some passed, others just stopped calling. And Helen, too proud to chase anyone, let them go. By the time the diagnosis came, she was already fading. It didn't shock her. In a strange way, it felt merciful. Like someone had finally acknowledged what she already knew, that she was disappearing quietly and now had permission to finish the job. She began organizing her affairs with quiet precision, canceling subscriptions, boxing up belongings, labeling old photo albums for donation. There would be no funeral, no announcement, just a sealed letter to the bank and a final key left on the kitchen table. Days passed in a routine of quiet erasure. Helen would wake at 6:45 a.m. sharp, make a cup of black tea, and sit in the armchair watching the light move across the floor. She ate toast without butter. She fed the birds. She reread old postcards. She said very little, even to herself. No one knocked, no one called. And Helen didn't expect them to. Then one afternoon, it rained. Not a light drizzle, but a full sudden downpour. Thunder cracked above the neighborhood, like someone tearing the sky open. Helen had just set her mug on the counter when she heard it. A knock. Firm. Unexpected. Real. She froze. It had been months, maybe years since someone had knocked on her door without warning. She opened it slowly, half expecting a solicitor, or worse, a mistake. But standing there was a young man, no older than 20, drenched from head to toe. He held a large yellow envelope in his hands and squinted at a piece of paper. Hi, sorry. I think I've got the wrong house, he said quickly, brushing wet hair from his forehead. I was delivering this for Mrs. Ellen Park, but this says 308 Pine. You're Helen Park, she corrected, surprised to hear her name aloud. No Ellen here. The young man looked at the label again, then chuckled awkwardly. Figures, my handwriting's awful. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. He turned to leave, and Helen, without fully understanding why, said, Wait, do you want to step inside for a second, dry off? He blinked, hesitated, then nodded. Helen hadn't invited anyone into her house in over 2 years. She rushed to grab a towel from the hallway and handed it to the young man, who smiled and muttered thanks as he dried his face. And hands! He introduced himself as Daniel, a volunteer with the local postal support program. Young people delivering documents and checking in on isolated seniors. It's a new initiative, he explained. Community outreach, especially after COVID. Just helping out. Helen nodded, not knowing what to say. Daniel looked around the living room and smiled. Oh, this place smells like books. I was a librarian, she replied, surprised at her own voice. 32 years. That explains the wall of classics. He pointed toward the built-in shelf overflowing with Dickens, Austen, Baldwin, and Atwood. For a moment, the rain was the only sound between them. Daniel didn't push conversation. He just sipped the tea she offered and let the quiet settle. Then he said, You don't have to be alone, you know. Helen's throat tightened. I'm not lonely. Daniel nodded again, not dismissively, not pitying, just gently. Of course. He stood to leave, thanking her for the tea. Helen followed him to the door, and as he stepped onto the porch, he said, I'll be around here again Thursday. If you're up for another cup. Helen didn't answer. She just watched him walk off into the rain. But that night, for the first time in weeks, she left the living room light on, just in case someone came back. Thursday came. Helen almost didn't make tea. She told herself it had just been politeness, nothing more. Surely Daniel had dozens of homes to visit, dozens of lonely people to sit with. Why would he return? But part of her, small, quiet, but insistent, set out 2 cups anyway. When the knock came at 4:02 p.m., she was already waiting. He stood there with the same yellow envelope as before. "This time it really is for you," he said with a grin. Though it's just a flyer from the community center. She took it with a half smile. They sat, talked about books again. Helen mentioned she once met Maya Angelou at a literary conference. Daniel listened, eyes wide, genuinely impressed overall. The next few weeks, this became their rhythm. Thursdays meant tea. Conversations about stories, music, recipes, grief. Helen never mentioned her diagnosis. Daniel never asked. The silence between them became a sanctuary, not a void. One day, Helen baked scones. Daniel arrived, surprised and touched. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." After he left, Helen found herself humming. It startled her. That night, she pulled a dusty journal from her bookshelf, the one Walter had given her years ago. She opened to the first blank page and wrote, "Today, I felt like I existed." Helen started keeping a new routine. She still marked the calendar, still counted the weeks since her diagnosis, but now each Thursday had a gold star. Not as a countdown, but as a promise. Daniel began staying longer. He told her about his family, his mother who raised him alone, his younger sister who dreamed of being a painter. He shared little victories, like passing his college exams or finally fixing his old bike. Helen, in turn, began opening drawers she hadn't touched in years. She showed him photographs, black and white snapshots of her and Walter dancing, of the library where she once worked, of her first apartment. They laughed. Sometimes they cried, but mostly they simply existed together in a quiet companionship neither had expected. On the 8th Thursday, Daniel arrived with a worn paperback in his hands. "It's my favorite," he said. "I thought you might like." "Yeah." It was The Little Prince. Helen read it in one sitting, then reread it the next morning. She circled one line 3 times. "What is essential is invisible to the eye." She closed the book and placed it on a nightstand beside her bed. And for the first time since the diagnosis, she didn't check how many days had passed. She didn't count the time. She just let the day arrive and sat with it. No fear, no rush, just presence. By the 10th Thursday, Daniel noticed something different. Helen's hair, once in a messy bun, was neatly brushed. A soft lavender blouse replaced her usual faded cardigan. The dining table had fresh flowers, dandelions, and an old teacup. "You look good," he said, surprised. "I feel like myself again," she replied. Then, after a pause, added, "At least some part of her." They didn't talk much that afternoon. They didn't need to. As Daniel left, Helen handed him a folded piece of paper. "Something I wrote. Don't open it until you get home." He nodded and tucked it into his jacket. When he read it that night, it said, "I was given 3 months to die, but someone reminded me how to live, and in doing so, gave me more days than any doctor could. I don't know how many I have left, but now I'll use them." Daniel wiped his eyes and folded the letter with reverence. He didn't reply. He returned Thursday as always, same time, same tea, same smile, and Helen met him at the door. Not as a woman waiting to die, but as someone quietly learning how to live again. She didn't tell him she was scared. She didn't have to. He stayed anyway, and sometimes that's what healing looks like. That night before bed, Helen lit a candle. She didn't know why, but it felt like a way to mark something. Not an ending, not a beginning, just a moment she'd remember, if tomorrow came. The following Thursday, Daniel arrived holding a paper bag and a nervous smile. "I brought something," he said. Inside the bag were 2 muffins, still warm, and a used copy of a novel titled Still Alice. "It's a bit heavy," he warned. "But it's honest." Helen took the book in her hands, nodded, and smiled. "Honest is good." They read it together, 1 chapter at a time, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, interrupted only by shared glances and steaming mugs of tea. That book was about memory loss, but Helen knew it wasn't really about forgetting, it was about holding on. The week they finished it, Daniel asked, "Would you ever consider writing your story?" Helen blinked. "My story?" He nodded. "Everything you've told me, all. The letters, the old memories, the journal. It might help someone." Helen looked down. Her hands trembled a little. "I don't know where I'd even begin." Daniel shrugged gently. "Maybe with the sentence you wrote that day. Today, I felt like I existed." The next morning, Helen sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring in. She opened her journal and wrote for hours. She didn't edit. She didn't overthink. She just let the words come. Pages filled with memories of childhood, of first kisses, of disappointments, of music she once loved, of Walter's laugh, of that awful hospital hallway, and of the boy who knocked at her door with rain dripping from his nose. She didn't write to be read. She wrote to remember, and that was enough to start. Over the next few weeks, the journal became a second heartbeat in Helen's routine. She wrote every morning, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes until the sun had moved across the kitchen floor and her tea had gone cold. Writing pulled things out of her she didn't know were still inside. Anger, laughter, longing, and the kind of hope that terrified her because it meant she still wanted more time. Daniel kept coming. He never asked to read the journal, and Helen never offered, but their conversations deepened. They talked about regrets. Daniel wished he had said goodbye to his father before he died. Helen admitted she hadn't spoken to her sister in over a decade after a falling out that neither one had dared to repair. Daniel said, "You should write to her." Helen shook her head. "It's been too long." He looked at her. "You've said that about a lot of things." She didn't reply. That night, she didn't sleep. At 2:13 a.m., she got up, made a cup of chamomile tea, and opened a new page in the journal. But this time, she didn't write about the past. She wrote a letter. "Dear Carolyn, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if you'll want to read it, but I've been thinking about you every day. I was diagnosed 3 months ago. I thought it would be the end. But something unexpected happened instead." She paused, then kept writing. 2 weeks later, Helen received a letter. The envelope was pink. Familiar handwriting. She stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. Inside, a short message. "Dear Helen, I cried when I saw your name. I've missed you more than I ever said. I don't care how long it's been. I want to come see you. Love, Carolyn." Helen read the letter 3 times. Then she placed it beside her tea and wept. She didn't cry out of guilt or fear or sadness. She cried because the door she thought she had locked forever had just creaked open. She told Daniel the following Thursday. He grinned, handed her a fresh notebook, and said, "Better make space for new chapters." Carolyn arrived the next Sunday. They embraced on the front porch and didn't let go for a full minute. Inside, they talked for hours about their parents, their stubbornness, the decades lost, and the months that still mattered. Carolyn stayed. The night, Helen made pancakes in the morning, something she hadn't done in years. And when she waved goodbye from the front steps, she whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Caroline replied, "I never did. I was just waiting for you to remember." That night, Helen added a new entry to her journal. "Some doors don't stay locked. Sometimes all it takes is a knock." The transformation was quiet but undeniable. Helen no longer counted days. Instead, she counted letters. Ones she wrote, ones she received, ones she never sent but needed to write anyway. Daniel noticed the change. Her house smelled like cinnamon again. Her window plants had bloomed. She even installed a wind chime, so the air had music when she opened the front door. One afternoon, Daniel brought a small portable recorder. "Would you mind?" he asked. "Just reading something you've written?" "For the community centers. Story archive." Helen hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "My voice sounds old." "Your voice sounds lived in," Daniel said. She agreed. They recorded her reading a piece she had written just a week prior. The hardest thing about dying isn't the pain. It's the assumption that your story stops being valuable. But maybe, in these final pages, I've written my best chapters. The recording was played during a storytelling night at the community center. People clapped. Some cried. One woman asked for a copy to send to her mother in hospice care. Daniel returned with the news, and Helen just smiled, stunned. "I didn't think anyone would care," he replied. "They didn't need to know you. They just needed to hear someone say what they couldn't." Helen placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "Then maybe I did something that mattered." She didn't need applause. She just needed to be heard. And now she was. That winter, Helen surprised Daniel with a wrapped box. He opened it to find a hand-bound book, her journal, copied and organized with a handwritten dedication on the first page for Daniel, for knocking, for staying, for reminding me that even the end of the story deserves to be told with love. He didn't say anything at first. He just hugged her. And for the first time, Helen let herself be held like that, without bracing, without apology. Later that evening after he left, Helen sat alone with a blanket over her knees and tea cooling beside her. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Inside, it was warm. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the ticking clock, not to her own heartbeat, but to something deeper, a knowing, a peace. The fear she had carried since the doctor's words had not vanished, but it no longer ruled her. She still didn't know how much time she had, but she no longer needed the answer, because now her days were not a countdown. They were gifts, and she was done wasting them. The next morning, she sent a package to the community center. 3 copies of her story, printed and labeled, free to anyone who needs hope. One went to a caregiver, another to a grieving daughter, and the third to a woman who had also been given 3 months to live. She too began to write. On a bright spring morning, one that arrived long after her original prognosis, Helen opened her curtains and breathed in the sunlight like it was air from another world. She didn't feel cured. She felt present. There was no miracle drug, no sudden reversal, just days, one after the next, filled with small, quiet reasons to stay awake. Letters, tea, laughter, pages, presents. Caroline called every weekend now. Daniel still showed up on Thursdays, though sometimes they didn't even speak. Just sat together, the way old friends do when words aren't required. Helen had a new journal now. Its cover read simply, After. She filled it slowly, and that was okay. One afternoon, she reread a line she had written in her first notebook. I thought I was waiting to die, but I was waiting to be found, she added beneath it, and then I was. That night, Helen left her window cracked open. The breeze carried in the scent of blooming lilacs and a distant melody from a neighbor's wind chime. She smiled to herself, tucked the blanket tighter around her legs and whispered, not the end. Just another Thursday, and for once she meant it. Helen's relationship with Daniel deepened, but something else was quietly stirring. She began to feel stronger, not just emotionally, but physically. Her energy returned in small waves. She could stand longer, walk farther. Her appetite improved. 3 months had passed. The deadline the doctors gave her had come and gone, but Helen was still here. She didn't rush to hospitals or chase explanations. She simply woke up each morning with gratitude and curiosity. Every Thursday, Daniel arrived with something new, a poem, a question, a photo from his childhood. Helen, in turn, began cooking small meals again, her kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and fresh bread. She played records. She laughed. Then came a knock she didn't expect. Her sister, Caroline. Tears formed instantly. They hadn't seen each other in 14 years. No words. Just a long embrace in the hallway, as if picking up mid-sentence. Carolyn stayed the weekend. They talked about their parents, their childhood fights, their last phone call. That night, Helen whispered, I thought I'd die before making things right. Caroline answered, maybe that's why you're still here. For the first time in over a decade, Helen fell asleep with peace beside her. After Carolyn's visit, Helen's days took on a new rhythm. She and her sister started calling each other every evening. Not long conversations, just enough to share. How the day had gone, a recipe or an old memory that surfaced. Helen began a project, a collection of letters titled To the Ones Who Might Still Come Back. It was meant for people like her. People who had broken relationships but still hoped for a knock on the door. She wrote letters she'd never send. To Walter, to her mother, even to her younger self. Each one ended the same way. I forgive you. I'm listening now. Daniel read one and asked, do you think this could help others? Helen hesitated. I don't know, she said, but it's helping me. So they printed a few copies, left them at the community center. A stack disappeared in days. Requests came in. Could she write more? She did. Without fanfare, without signing her name. People just called them Helen letters. They became a quiet movement. Read aloud at hospice centers, left on park benches, slid under doors during difficult holidays. They weren't instructions, they were invitations to begin again. One Thursday, Daniel brought her a letter. It wasn't from a reader, it was from the hospital. Helen hadn't gone back for checkups since her diagnosis, but Daniel had scheduled a full panel behind her back. You're mad? He asked. She wasn't. She was terrified. That evening, she opened the letter. Her hands trembled. The results showed stabilization, no progression, some improvement. She reread the sentence again and again. No immediate evidence of disease advancement. Helen didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just exhaled, deep and full. She told Caroline first, who screamed over the phone, then wept. Then she told Daniel, who simply said, "I knew it. You've been fighting without even realizing." But Helen didn't see it as a fight. She saw it as surrender to life, to others, to possibility. That night, she wrote, maybe healing doesn't always look like medicine. Maybe it looks like conversation, like connection, like Thursday tea. She still lived with uncertainty, but it no longer caged her. It humbled her and made each sunrise a quiet triumph, not because she beat anything, but because she kept showing up. With her health stable and her spirit lighter, Helen began walking. Again, just around the block at first. Then to the community garden. She'd sit under the same oak tree Walter once planted, now taller than the roof of their old home. Birds nested in its limbs. Children played beneath it. Helen brought her notebook, sometimes to write, sometimes just to be. One day, a stranger approached her bench. An older man with trembling hands and tired eyes. He asked, "Are you Helen?" She nodded. He sat beside her without asking. "My daughter left 3 years ago. I haven't known how to move since." Helen didn't offer advice. She tore a page from her notebook and handed it to him. On it, one sentence, "You're not too late." He folded it, cried silently, thanked her. When he left, Helen whispered to herself, "I'm still not sure why I'm here." Then looked up at the tree and added, "But maybe it's for this." That evening, she wrote in her journal, "I think the miracle wasn't that I lived longer, it's that I learned how to live softer." And with that, she turned the page, ready for one more. Word about Helen spread slowly but surely. The local newspaper ran a small piece about her. Local woman defies odds with letters of hope. A librarian from across town requested copies of her letters for a reading circle. Then a hospice nurse asked for one to read during family sessions. Helen didn't feel like a hero. She still had her quiet days, her uncertain mornings, her ache for Walter's voice. But now they didn't define her. One morning, she walked past a telephone pole and noticed something taped there, a printed letter she had written months ago. "Dear stranger, you are not your grief. You are the breath after it." No signature, just those words. She smiled, heart full. When she returned home, she opened a fresh notebook. This one she titled "Letters Left Behind." She began writing with the intention of absence. What would she want someone to find a year from now, or 5? She wrote about fear, about forgiveness, about how sometimes the bravest thing is making tea and facing the window. She ended each letter the same way. If you're still reading, you're still here. And that means something. The notebook filled slowly, but that was the point. Helen wasn't racing death, she was walking with life. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel behind. She felt present, exactly where she was supposed to be. One afternoon, Daniel brought a question. "If someone wanted to share your letters more widely, would that be okay?" Helen looked at him. "I thought I was writing for myself." "You were," he said, "but maybe that's why it matters." Together, they selected a few letters, typed them, printed 10 copies, left them at the community center tucked between newsletters and appointment cards. By the next Thursday, they were gone. Helen added a line in her notebook. "Maybe the words we whisper to survive are the ones someone else needs to begin." Carolyn visited that weekend and brought a small surprise. A framed photo of Helen sitting by the window, journal open, sunlight on her hands. "This," she said, "is who you became." Helen stared at it for a long time. She hadn't realized how alive she looked. That night, she didn't write anything profound. She just scribbled, "Today was quiet, beautifully quiet." I think that's what healing looks like. She went to bed early, window cracked, wind chimes stirring softly, and a deep sense that even if tomorrow never came, today had been enough, more than enough. After all that time, Helen's legacy had become something she never intended, but everything the world needed. Daniel continued sharing her letters, but now he wasn't alone. A small team at the community center began digitizing every note, organizing them into themes: grief, forgiveness, starting over, love left unspoken. They launched a free digital archive, the Helen Collection. Within weeks, hundreds of people accessed it. Some just read. Others printed the letters and left them in coffee shops, on subway seats, folded inside library books. It became a movement, quiet but steady, one that didn't ask for attention, just connection. Caroline took it further. She painted again, small canvases based on quotes from Helen's journals. One featured a windowsill with a teacup and folded paper, sunlight pouring through soft curtains. The caption read, "Today was quiet, beautifully quiet." It sold instantly. She donated the proceeds to a fund that supported elderly writers and hospice storytelling. And every time she told someone about the project, she began the same way. It all started with 3 borrowed months. Daniel, meanwhile, kept the podcast alive. He'd introduce each episode with the same words. "You're listening to Unbroken Stories, and if you're still here, so is your story." One day, nearly a year after Helen passed, a letter arrived at the community center. There was no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten. I was sitting on the edge. Truly, someone handed me a letter signed, "Still here." I then jumped. I walked home. I made tea. I want to live again. Whoever wrote that, thank you. Daniel read it aloud during the next podcast episode. There was silence afterward. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because nothing needed to be said. Helen's voice, though gone, still echoed in folded paper, in late-night journal entries. In quiet mornings that started with presence instead of panic, Caroline framed the letter, hung it above her desk, and whenever she doubted herself, her art, her role in this whole ripple, she'd read it again and remember. This started with one knock and one yes. At the community center, Helen's chair remained by the window. No one sat there. Not out of reverence, but because it was always meant to be a place for return. People still came, still wrote, still whispered to themselves, "I'm still here," because she had reminded them they were. On the 1-year anniversary of Helen's passing, the community center hosted a gathering. It wasn't labeled a memorial. It was called a celebration of stillness. There was no guest list, no formal speeches, just a circle of chairs, a kettle of tea, a stack of blank paper and pens. Daniel arrived early and placed one photo at the center of the table. Helen, smiling faintly, window light catching her hair, a pen in her hand. Guests arrived slowly. A nurse who had once cared for Helen, a teenager who had found her letter on a park bench, a widow who read her book every night before bed. They didn't talk about grief. They talked about letters, about forgiveness, about the strange power of being seen, even by someone you never met. Then, together they wrote. Some wrote to lost parents, some to old friends, some just wrote to themselves. No one was required to share, but many did. One man stood, tearful but steady, and read aloud. "I thought my story was finished, but she taught me how to pick up the pen again." And just like that, the room became something sacred. Not in silence, but in shared breath. As the sun set that evening, someone placed a handwritten note on the windowsill beside Helen's chair. It read, "Thank you for proving that borrowed time can still write eternal stories." Carolyn lit a candle. Daniel closed the circle, and as people filtered out, they left letters behind, folded pages, poems, scribbled truths, unfinished thoughts, some addressed to no one, some addressed to Helen, all addressed to healing. Helen never asked to be remembered. She asked to be useful, to be felt. And today her story lives not because she tried to go viral, but because she chose to go deep, deep into her own heart, deep into the silence, deep enough to remind all of us that it's never too late, that we don't need perfect words to begin again, and that if we're still here, our story still matters. So if you're reading this now and something inside you feels cracked, unfinished, or forgotten, write, speak, breathe, because somewhere, someone needs the story only you can tell. Subscribe to Unbroken Stories, and let's keep proving together that the end is rarely the end. Sometimes it's just the right page. Spring returned. The oak tree outside Helen's old house bloomed again, full and loud with birdsong. A small plaque had been placed at its base by a neighbor, planted with love, grown with letters. No one explained. They didn't have to. Every Thursday, someone still left something under that tree. A note, a flower, a folded napkin with a quote scribbled in pencil. Helen's house had been sold to a young couple. They kept the wind chimes. They said it made the porch feel alive. Caroline still painted. Daniel moved to a new city but continued the podcast, now featuring stories from people around the world who had started their own letter rituals. after reading Helen's book. Some read them aloud in therapy, some left them in recovery centers, some just wrote them and burned them, releasing the words to the sky. But all of them began the same way. Dear whoever needs this. And ended with still here. Because that was Helen's real miracle. She didn't rewrite her ending, she rewrote the meaning of middle, and in doing so, helped thousands realize they were never running out of time. They were finally stepping into it.